Okay, here's a quick look at how we animate images inside of After Effects. Now, before we start animating our image, it's a good idea to know how big your image is. So if you forget or you downloaded a bunch of images and you want to get the size, make sure to set it into the list view using this little list view button in the lower left-hand corner. Once you've done that, you can then use the scroll bar to scroll over in the project window and see that your video is 3,264 pixels by 2,448. And 1.0 means that they are square pixels, which means they'll work just fine in an HD format. So the first issue we run into is that we can't drag this image over here to create a timeline. Now, if you're adding this to a timeline that's already got video clips in it, then you'll have no problem. But if you're starting from scratch, you want to create an HD timeline, and dragging this over won't do that. It will create a timeline that is this size, and unfortunately none of our video clips will match that size. So in order to create a new sequence or timeline, just go up to File, New, Sequence. And what we're going to do is pick a preset. Now, one of the most generalized presets you'll find are the digital SLR options. Notice if we come down to 1080, there's a DSLR 1080 at 24 frames a second that's going to work just fine for us. So we'll pick that one. We can give it a title here if we want to, and we'll click OK. Now we have a timeline, and when we bring this image in, we'll notice that the image is going to get cropped. Right? The timeline is set to 1920 by 1080, but our image is 3000 by 2400. So we have a couple options at this point. Some of the most basic options would be to just simply right-click on the clip itself and choose Scale to Frame Size or Set to Frame Size. If we choose Scale to Frame Size, you notice that it fits, but we end up with these bars because the shape of the picture doesn't match our 16 by 9 aspect ratio. And you'll notice that if I choose the other option, Set to Frame Size, it's not going to be any better. So we actually need to take control over this and do it ourselves. And that's where the effects control window comes into play. So if I double click on this image here, you'll notice that it then opens it in this window over here, and right there you'll see where it says Effects Controls. If I click on that, you'll see that we have 5 parameters in our motion option. That's the only one we're going to focus on right now. Those options are position, scale, rotation, anchor point, and anti-flicker filter. So just to be clear, anti-flicker filter is generally for removing flicker created by LED lights or bad fluorescent lights. Also, it can be used to remove the flicker from a computer screen. So quite honestly, we're going to ignore that one for now. We're just going to focus on the ones that actually make things move. So if I go over to position, you see I have two numbers. I have my X number, which is my side to side, and my Y, which is my up and down. These numbers work like scroll bars, meaning that if I click on it and drag, you'll see that image moving in my timeline, or excuse me, in my program viewer. If I click on the other one, you'll see the same thing. Now, if you get your image all messed up and you want to get it back to where it was, you can simply move your mouse down and hit this reset button right here. And that will reset the parameter back to its default spot, which is essentially centered on this frame. Now next to it we do have a scale control, and if I start to scale this down, you can see that if we were going to do this ourselves, we could probably frame it something like that. And it's going to look a whole lot nicer than the set to frame size option. But again, the scale, just like the position, I can click and drag right on that number like a scroll wheel, like a scroll bar. The next is rotation, and if I click and drag, you'll see this is rotating in degrees. If I go 360, it's going to take me back to there. And notice it says 1x. That means I've rotated this one full time. So you can always use that shorthand rather than having to use 360 degrees. So if you want to make it spin twice, rather than typing in 720, you could just type in 2x. And then finally, that brings us down to anchor point. Anchor point is simply the position which the image will rotate or scale around. Right now, the anchor point by default is in the middle of our image, but you'll notice if I click and drag, I can put it in different places. Now, this control actually moves the image in relation to its anchor point. So you'll see if I rotate it now, it's rotating around the upper corner. If I scale it down, it might be even a little easier to see that we now are rotating around the upper corner. And again, I can hit reset, and that'll put it back in the middle. Now it's rotating around the center. It's also going to scale from the center. And so that's what anchor point's going to do. Anchor point isn't necessarily used to move things around, but it is used to reset the point with which they scale or rotate. So we'll go back and hit reset on that option. We'll reset our rotation, and we'll reset our scale and position. So at this point, moving them is relatively uncomplicated, and it's worth mentioning that if you click the word motion, you can actually get all of those controls right on your screen. Notice I have a bounding box now. I can drag this image around. I can scale it by grabbing the corners. I can put my mouse up here and rotate. And really probably the most valuable aspect of doing it this way is that now I can actually move the anchor point by simply clicking and dragging it rather than repositioning the image around the anchor point. So if I wanted it to spin right around the word 2, I could put it right there, and you'll see it rotates around that word or scales from that word as well. So the main benefit of clicking the word motion is the ability to put that anchor point exactly where you want it. And if you like dragging things around and animating that way, you have that option. Okay, now that we know how to move things around, let's go ahead and learn how to animate them so that they move on their own. So animation inside of Adobe Premiere is extremely simple, but almost confusing in its simplicity. So let's go ahead and run through this real quick. Reset my rotation. And let's start off by scaling this from nothing up to a point where it fills the screen. So if we want to create that animation, we could start by basically putting the playhead wherever we want the animation to begin. In this case, I want it to begin right at the beginning. So with the playhead at the beginning of my clip, I can set the scale to whatever I want it to be at the beginning. If I want it to be invisible, I can scale it down to 0 and we won't see anything. Now, if that's where I want it to start animating, and that's how I want it to look at the beginning of the animation, all I need to do now is click the stopwatch for that parameter. If I click the stopwatch for scale, you'll notice, I'm going to click and move this here, we get a little keyframe right there. And all that is a little piece of information that says at this time, have a scale value of 0. Okay? Now all I have to do to animate that is move the playhead and change the value. You'll notice that I automatically get a second keyframe just by moving the playhead and changing the value. That's all you have to do. And now between these 2 points, it's going to animate between 63% and 0. If I hit the space bar and let it play, you'll see we have a very slow scale-up animation. It starts at 0 and it ends at 63 or 64, I think. We'll see. 63. Okay, and notice that after it stops growing and passes that keyframe, nothing happens. Now, keyframes are very flexible. If I want that animation to happen faster, all I need to do is move the keyframes closer together. And now we'll see a much faster animation because the keyframes are closer, so it's going to take less time for that change to happen. Okay? All right. And now, again, if I wanted it slower, I could put it way over here, and as you can see, it's growing very slowly. All right. So, if at any point I change my mind, and maybe I think, you know what, 63 is too much. I'm cropping off the word welcome. I didn't do that right. I need to do it less. Well, all I have to do to change that final value or the initial value is put my playhead back over the keyframe. Now, trying to drag it over the keyframe is risky because most of the time you're going to end up being off by a frame or two, and what's going to happen is you're actually going to create an unwanted keyframe. And so because of that, Adobe gave us these little arrows right here that allow us to jump between our keyframes. And with these arrows, I can be sure that I'm right on top of that keyframe. So now that I have the playhead right on top of it, I can change this 63 value to something else. If I want to keep the word welcome in there, maybe I'd opt to do something like this. And now you'll notice that if I click back and hit the space bar, that it's going to stop at 46, which was the new value that I gave it. Okay? And essentially all of these parameters work the same way. Let's go ahead and undo all of this animation. Now we can do that in one click by hitting the stopwatch next to the parameter that we animated. So if I hit the stopwatch next to the scale parameter, I'll get a little warning that says this action will delete existing keyframes. So just to be clear, you never need to hit the stopwatch more than once unless you want to delete your keyframes. So I'll click OK, and you'll notice that will delete all of those keyframes. I can reset the scale value to 100, and there we go. So let's say that rather than scaling this up, I wanted to use the motion parameter. Well, I could click the stopwatch. Again, think, where do you want the animation to begin? Well, if I want it to begin at the very beginning, then put the playhead there. And think about how you want it to look at the very beginning. Do I want it to look like this? Maybe I should choose to start it maybe over a little bit. Now, and think about what you want to do in your animation. For this animation, let's have it move towards the left, and we'll have it reveal the California sign. So what I'll do instead is I'll do something like this, where it slides into the frame. Let's go ahead and bring it down just a touch more, and we'll have it right there. Okay, so at this point, all I'm going to animate is my X value, the left and right horizontal value, which is the first set of numbers. This is my vertical. So all I'm going to do is, again, get a shot at, put the image, make the image look how I want it to look at the beginning of the animation. That's like this. Decide where I want the animation to begin and put the playhead in that position. Now notice this playhead is exactly the same as this one. Notice they both move in tandem, and the only difference is this is where we can see our keyframes. Now, since we can see our keyframes here, having a little more real estate's not a bad thing. I don't know why Premiere gives us all this empty space in here. So what we can do is we can put our mouse right there and kind of squeeze that over a little bit. That gives us way more room to see our keyframes and remove some of that unused area. So I'll put the playhead at the beginning. I'll click the value, the stopwatch for position, and notice I get a little keyframe. Now since I'm on the very first frame, you're only seeing half the keyframe, but I can pull it out and it's there. So I'll put that back, and now I will just drag the playhead however far I want it to take to animate. And the fact is, it doesn't even really matter because I can always just drag these keyframes closer to each other. So in this case, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I think I went probably, let's go to right about here. All right, so all I'm going to do now that I've moved the playhead is I'm going to change this value. In this case, I'm just going to drag it over from the right and stop right about there when we see the edge of the frame. And if I back up, you can see that this is all animated now. All right. Now, if you want to animate two things, you can actually animate scale and position. So if I have this animated, I could also come over and put a scale keyframe in there. And right now I'm at 100%. If I come over here, I could go a little bit bigger, scale it up a bit, or maybe even scale it down just a touch. Quite honestly, maybe scale it up a bit. But if I scale it up a bit, now I kind of need to adjust the position. Well, again, as long as I'm right over that keyframe, I could drop this down a little bit and bring it in a little. Now you'll notice, as I said, I actually wasn't right over that keyframe. We created a second keyframe there. Notice that it moves between those two keyframes. So all I need to do in this case, I can delete the second keyframe by selecting it and hitting the delete key. And now you'll notice that it's doing pretty much exactly what I wanted. It's been scaled up a little bit. And it's moving left to right. Okay. And finally, if we wanted to add a little rotation into that, we could. I wouldn't add more than a degree or two because we'll end up seeing the edges of the image. But let's go ahead and click the rotation button. Let's drag the playhead. Now, again, if we want it to be lined up, rather than dragging the playhead, we could use these arrows and jump to our keyframes. That's a better idea. And now we'll rotate this just a couple of degrees, just so we can say we added in a little bit of rotation. So it's rotating -3 degrees, and now you can see that we're getting just a slight rotation in there, but our scale and position look just fine. Now, if I wanted this to animate the entire duration of the image, I could select those keyframes and drag them all the way to the end, and now it's going to animate the entire duration of that image. And actually it isn't, because we're not seeing the entire image. Notice that I had this bar shrunk. So again, click and drag them all the way to the end. I'd have to stretch this out quite a bit, and this would be a ridiculously slow animation. But it is an option if that's what you're going for. And the only thing that I would want to show you on top of that is the fact that they've actually brought in some really cool elements of After Effects into Adobe Premiere. And what I'm referring to is the ability to ease our motion. Now, right now we have what's called linear motion, which basically means that this starts at one speed and continues at that speed right until it stops. Now, generally speaking, that is not what we consider to be great looking motion. It just gets right into speed and literally just slams to a stop when we hit those keyframes. So what you can do to make that motion look smoother is you can select all the keyframes by just clicking and dragging out a box. And notice that I was able to extend that box over all of these keyframes. And now if I right click, I can go down to temporal interpolation. And in this case, I'm actually going to deselect the first set. I'm just going to select the second set and right click and choose ease in. Think about it like a car easing into a parking spot, right? You're driving fast on the freeway, but you slowly ease into a parking spot. And then I'm going to go to the first group of keyframes and right click and choose temporal interpolation ease out. And if you really want to see what's happening here, you can hit the little drop down and you'll see that we now have a grid, or sort of a speed graph that shows us that we are starting slow, we're hitting our maximum speed up at the top, and then we're slowing down. Same thing with rotation. We have these graphs. Now these blue handles are actually what we call Bezier handles, and we can use those to modify this motion. If I drag this forward, it's going to take even longer to get up to speed. It'll reach its maximum speed here and then ease to a stop. If I do the same thing with scale, it'll take longer to scale up And if I do the same thing with position, it'll move into that position a little slower. When it starts to hit this ramp, it'll speed up and then it'll ease back to a stop. Again, you don't have to come through and mess with these, but if you just simply right-click on your keyframes and ease them in and ease them out, you'll notice that your motion looks a lot better. Let's take a look. All right, see how it kind of zips and then stops. So we had a little bit of a slow start, then it moves quickly and quickly eases to a stop. All right, so that is essentially all you need to know to get animating inside of Adobe Premiere. Hope this helps.